Suppose, first of all, Rishi
Morning,
Sunak,
Tom.
Marginally ahead with the general public, but a little bit behind when it comes to those who voted Conservative last time round. Is that a worry?
Well, I was quite interested in your bit of digging down there into those numbers, because from what I saw in those opinion polls as well, Rishi was double on both competence and on having a credible economic policy. And I think when it comes down to it, that's what Conservative members are going to be wanting to think about when it comes to leadership contests. I thought he did a cracking job last night, and I think he started to expose some of those arguments that Liz has been putting forwards. Particularly, I thought that one around trying to spread the debt that we've got into very long-term bonds, like war bonds, which has been a mainstay of her policy. And we all know that actually, if you've got an interest-only mortgage, which is essentially the same as a government bond, if you try and get a longer-term one, you pay higher interest rates. It's exactly the same for the government. And with £2 trillion worth of debt, that would mean an extra £16 billion a year on 5-year versus 30-year bonds. And that's a lot of money to find every single year. It dwarfs the corporation tax cuts that she's also proposing. So I think on the big economic arguments, Liz just isn't there, sadly.
And yet when Faisal Islam asked Rishi Sunak if he could name a single other G7 country that was raising taxes in response to the COVID crisis, he couldn't name one.
Well, what you've seen actually Rishi do in the last couple of months, we've seen a tax cut for all people in work in the UK. That's raising the threshold from under £10,000 to £12,500 for people in work before they pay national insurance, and also that tax cut for people who have to use petrol to drive. But that also has a knock-on impact in terms of things like food prices, because everything has to be transported at some point by road as well. Rishi's always been realistic about what he wants to do. He wants to control inflation first and then move towards getting taxes down in the medium and longer term. That is the responsible way of doing things, because otherwise all we'll see is that inflation eating up any tax cuts that are put forwards. And I think the danger with what Liz is proposing is we see interest rates, as our own economic advisors have said, rising to 5, 6, 7%, and then you've got to throw on, that's just the base rate. So, you know, people pay more than that when they're borrowing money for things like houses or businesses, and that's really going to squeeze so many households. An average person in my constituency with about 125 grand on their mortgage would see their mortgage interest payments rising by £500-600 a month, and that would just totally wipe out any possible tax savings.
Of course, Liz Truss in the debate called that Project Fear. I suppose we do need to wait and see if the interest rates would actually move that far. I do want to try and ask about the framing of this debate, though. We're talking about tax cuts. To some extent, isn't this not really tax cuts, but actually just cancelling tax rises? Rishi Sunak plans to raise corporation tax by a considerable degree next year. One of Liz Truss's so-called tax cuts is simply not going ahead with that tax rise. And the other big tax cut of Liz Truss is to reverse the tax rise that came in merely a couple of months ago. Is that really going to be particularly inflation?
Rishi's already got that long-term plan to see a reduction in income tax before the next general election. That's already in the Treasury book. So he's already got a long-term plan, which is working towards. But I think the key thing is, a bit like we saw with that levy on the oil and gas companies, what Rishi's always been pushing for is investment in the UK. That's been at the heart of what he's been trying to achieve. And I'm absolutely certain with things like the super deductor, that's exactly what we'll see going forwards from him as well. A real concentration on driving companies to invest. Because what I don't want to see is people not investing in the UK, not delivering those good jobs for places like northwest Durham or actually across the country, because that's what we really need to see. Investment in productivity, because you can only get real wage growth in the long term with proper productivity growth. And I think that's why people on the economy trust Rishi, because he can see where he's heading. They can see he wants to deliver that productivity growth that we all want to see, which allows people to have more real wages, allows proper long-term profit growth to expand and to be reinvested invested into companies and in the economy. That's why I'm backing Rishi. I think he's got a very clear long-term plan on those issues, and I really fear that Liz's short-termist policy would actually have the reverse impact to what she'd like to see, and see actually households being worse off. And I can tell you now that my constituents do not want to see those interest rate rises that Liz's economic advisors are suggesting would be their ideal new normal.